Welcome to the Heady NJ podcast, where we bring you up close and personal with cannabis influencers in New Jersey and beyond. I am your host, Brian Walsh, founder of Heady NJ. Through our guest interviews and informational segments, we will be bringing you everything you need to know about the cannabis industry in New Jersey. We will discuss the latest in news, culture, and lifestyle information in the world of cannabis right here on our podcast. With cannabis legalization just around the corner in our state, there isn't a more important time to know what is going on. Hello, today on the show we have Keith Stroup, founder of NORML, National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. Welcome, Keith. Thanks for joining us today.
Oh, nice to be with you.
So, Keith, for our listeners, why don't you start by just telling us a little bit about yourself, how you came to start NORML, because that's a pretty big feat to start this major organization.
Well, of course, when we started it, it wasn't a major organization. It was a small idea, or maybe I should say it was a large idea, but it was just a few of us, 5 or 6 of us that got together. The story really involves the anti-Vietnam War movement. I graduated law school, Georgetown Law School, in 1968, and it was the height of the Vietnam War and the height of the anti-war movement. And like many of my generation, I was doing everything possible to try to find a way to stay out of that war because I'd seen too many of my contemporaries coming home in body bags. And so by 1968, I was looking at every possibility, and a group called the National Lawyers Guild, which is still around, it's a good group of radical lefty lawyers, they were making themselves available at the time to provide advice to people who wanted to try to avoid the draft dodgers, I think they called us at the time. And they actually offered me a number of things. They offered to put me in touch with some psychiatrists in Baltimore who would say I was gay. And back then, if you were gay, it wasn't a matter of don't ask, don't tell. The Army or the military just simply didn't want you.
Wow.
I thought that was a kind of intriguing possibility, but I was married at the time and had a small child, and my wife wasn't terribly comfortable with that. They also offered to put me in touch with some people in Canada if I wanted to leave the country. That was something a lot of anti-war people were doing, and Canada was putting out the welcome mat, but the problem is there was no guarantee we'd ever be allowed back in the country. And although I certainly opposed the war in Vietnam, I wasn't necessarily at a spot in my life where I was willing to say, I never want to live in the U.S. again.
Yeah.
And finally, the third option they came up with, it was a deferment based on critical skills. It was called a critical skills deferment, and it was a provision in the Draft Act that said if the work that you were doing on the home front was important enough, then your draft board could give you a waiver from serving in the military, and instead of that, you'd serve those same 2 years at the domestic job you had, which in theory was important to the health, safety, and welfare of the country. I had just been offered a job by a commission called the National Commission on Product Safety. It was a presidential commission, and it sounded important, and my draft board gave me a deferment about 2 weeks before my report date. In other words, I had already passed my physical and had about 2 weeks before I had to report to the Army when I got what was called a critical skills deferment. So I spent those 2 years working for the National Commission on Product Safety in downtown Washington, D.C. Now, why that's important regarding the starting of NORML is that in that job, I got to know consumer advocate Ralph Nader and a group of young lawyers working with Ralph called Nader's Raiders at the time. Ralph had come to town. He wrote a book called Unsafe at Any Speed about the Corvair, and then he had come to D.C. and he would have these recent law graduates come and spend a couple of years working with him, and they were trying to identify unsafe household products that they could then go back to Congress and propose laws to make it a safer place for us to live in. During those 2 years, frankly, I wasn't that excited about product safety. I was excited about any excuse to stay out of Vietnam. But what I did learn during those 2 years was I learned about the field of public interest law. I had never heard of public interest law until I met Ralph. I didn't know what it meant, but all it really means is people who decide to use their legal skills and their law degree to impact public policy instead of working for individual clients.
Okay.
And while I was exhilarated with the idea of public interest law, product safety wasn't anything special to me, but I had started smoking marijuana when I was a freshman at Georgetown Law School. So by the time the commission was over in 1970, I'd been smoking for about 5 years. At that point, I was too old to be drafted. And so for the first time, I had a choice to do sort of what I wanted. And I decided I wanted to do public interest law, but the issue I wanted to work on was legalizing marijuana. So it was in late 1970 that, along with some friends that I knew had a similar interest, we sat down and began to put together the outline for NORML. I think we actually filed the corporate papers in early March of 71, but we began to meet as a board of directors in October of 1970.
Now, were you all attorneys that were involved in this formation?
No, actually, I'm trying to think. I think I was the only attorney in the original group. There were, one of the people was a journalist friend of mine, another was a friend I'd worked with on the Product Safety Commission, but no, I think I was the only attorney.
What were some of the things you started to work on when NORML first began, and how did that evolve over time?
When we first started, the challenge really was to let people know that there was a lobby for marijuana smokers. There had been some people working on marijuana legalization even before NORML, but not a lot. The first group that I'm aware of, the first group I've ever seen any reference to in the literature, was a group called LEMAR that was founded in New York State, and at one time they had 3 or 4 different chapters. LEMAR stood for Legalized Marijuana.
Okay.
LEMAR ended up evolving into a group called Amorphia. Amorphia was a group that was founded about the same time I founded NORML, but they were on the West Coast. And the unique thing about Amorphia was they raised their funding by selling rolling papers. They sold Acapulco Gold rolling papers. Now, it was a genius idea, kind of a circuitous path.
Right.
People that like to smoke buy your papers, and that funds you so you can help legalize marijuana. The problem was that rolling papers were also illegal back then.
Oh, wow.
And so at some point early on, after a couple of years, Amorphia was about to have to close down because they couldn't get any more papers. I think they got them at the time from someplace in Western Europe. And they were having trouble renewing their order and about to go out of business. So we sat down and negotiated a merger, whereas Amorphia became West Coast NORML, and their political director became our West Coast coordinator. And so we all began to operate under the name of NORML. And as I say, the first challenge was to try to let the smokers out there know that there was a lobby that was doing their best to represent the interest of responsible marijuana smokers. And that meant that anytime we had an excuse where there was any kind of a convention or a meeting or whatever where it seemed appropriate, NORML would go and we'd have a booth or an exhibit or whatever. And mainly, again, we didn't have a lot of achievements that we could point to because we had just started our work. But it was initially sufficient that people saw that you were standing up on their behalf. Most people at that point still thought marijuana smoking was something terribly dangerous and bad and should be avoided at all costs. And so if you were a marijuana smoker, it was rare indeed that you ran across any organization that was willing to argue that you shouldn't be treated like a criminal and it shouldn't be a crime to smoke marijuana. So our message was one that was well received by those who smoked marijuana at the time. But it is important to know that the Gallup polling organization had just done their first survey question in 1969, the year before we founded NORML, asking the American public how many people supported legalizing marijuana. Prior to 69, they didn't even think it was an important enough question to bother to ask. And when we started NORML, 12% of the American public supported our position. 88% of the public were opposed to legalizing marijuana. So
wow.
obviously, we realized at that point that we had a lot of hard work ahead of us before we could expect to legalize marijuana. We had to change a lot of minds. We had to educate a lot of people. So we set about as soon as possible doing that. And in fact, when I look back now, after all these years, it was the first year where we finally reached 50% support on the public, I think was 2011.
Wow.
And today we're up at 66% support. We have, I think, 5 different national surveys, including Gallup, that show between 63 and 66% support now. That's incredible that 2 out of 3 Americans now support legalizing marijuana when only 14% of the public are current smokers. Something around 40% have smoked marijuana at some time in their life, but only about 14% are regular smokers. So it becomes obvious when you realize that data that it is crucial that we maintain the support of the non-smokers. Without the fact that we finally won the hearts and minds of a majority of the non-smokers, we couldn't possibly legalize marijuana because you simply can't change laws with 14% support.
What do you think was the biggest catalyst to help change the perception? And then it seems like it grew faster from 2011 until the current time.
Yeah, there were 2 or 3 major points along the path. During the first decade, the main thing that gave us an opportunity to get our message out was that there was something created called the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse. What was the Federal Drug Act that preceded the Controlled Substances Act had been declared unconstitutional by a decision of the U.S. Supreme Court. It was actually an interesting decision where professor from Harvard that did the turn on, tune in, drop out,
Tim
Leary. Tim got busted coming back from Mexico with, I think he had 50 pounds of marijuana or something like that. And he had enough resources that he hired a good law firm and brought a constitutional challenge, and sure enough, he was successful.
Wow.
And so there were a period of several months in 1970 when there was no Federal Drug Act. But Congress, before too long, came up with what is still the Federal Drug Act. It's called the Controlled Substances Act of 1970. And most of that act is a bad drug act. In other words, it's based on the premise that anyone who uses any illicit drug is a bad person and should be arrested and thrown in jail. But Congressman Ed Koch, a gentleman who served several terms in the U.S. House of Representatives from New York and then later became mayor of New York City, when he was in Congress, he was a progressive, and he was very sympathetic to the idea of legalizing marijuana. So he managed to get a provision written into the act of the Controlled Substances Act that actually established this National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse. And the commission had 13 members. 9 of them were appointed by President Nixon, and 4 of them were picked by members of Congress from among themselves. And they spent 2 years studying drugs and drug policy and recommending changes. The first year was focused on marijuana, and the second year they focused on other drugs. And when the commission came around to focus on marijuana, they got major national press. You know, there were big hearings. Former Attorney General Ramsey Clark testified on our behalf here in Washington, and I managed to testify at one of their hearings on the West Coast. And so when the commission went out of business after their 2 years, their recommendation was that the state should eliminate all penalties for the personal possession and use of small amounts of marijuana. Now, initially, nobody did that. I mean, the recommendation was just sort of sitting there. And so the commission had gone out of business.
That was a federal recommendation for all of the states?
Well, it was a recommendation for both federal and state. They recommended that both Congress and the state legislatures should stop treating marijuana smokers as criminals, stop arresting them altogether. And I think, they didn't even recommend a fine. Well, what happened was because the commission went out of business, there was no one to sort of try to implement those recommendations. But obviously, NORML saw that as a great opportunity. So we spent the next 6-7 years traveling around the country, and anytime we could identify a state legislator who was willing to introduce a marijuana decriminalization bill. Again, now, their recommendation wasn't full legalization where you have a legal market,
right,
but at least it would have eliminated about 90% of the arrests. the ones that were for simple possession and use. So NORML began to travel from state to state, and anytime we had a legislator willing to introduce a decrim bill, we would bring in 3 or 4 or 5 expert witnesses, so that it wasn't just this young legislator saying something that might sound kind of radical to a lot of people, but we had doctors and lawyers and legislators and people that would come in who had a good bit of standing, and who would argue for the need to stop treating marijuana smokers like criminals. The first state to adopt a version of decriminalization was Oregon in 1973, and by 1978 we had a total of 11 states that had decriminalized marijuana. And frankly, we thought we were only a few years away from having decriminalization all across this country. But frankly, we underestimated the ability of the American public to change a position fairly quickly. And what happened was, starting in about 78 or 79, the mood of the country became more conservative. You had Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan, and you had the growth of the parents groups, they called them, where they argued that we shouldn't pass any laws having to do with marijuana unless we thought it was helpful for children. Well, obviously, that's a silly rule to try to apply. I mean, if you really did that, you couldn't drive a car or have sex or skydive or a whole slew of other things that are perfectly fine for adults, but would be inappropriate for children. Right. But nonetheless, there was a period of time from 1978 to 1996. We went 18 years without a single statewide legislative victory. That was a long, dry spell.
18 years.
The country was retrenching. And when you go back and look at the long line of results of Gallup polling, you can actually see it. At the time, of course, we didn't know, but you can look back and see that starting in about 78 or 79, our support began to slip a little, and it stayed down until around 1990, and then we started regaining public support, and we've never looked back. It's continued to increase since that time. But obviously, the fact that we had this presidential commission holding hearings and making recommendations, which led to having marijuana decriminalization bills introduced probably in at least 30 states over those next 6 or 7 years, gave us a lot of visibility, and it was during those years when most people in this country first learned of NORML.
Right, yeah. And that was the 80s, you're saying? I mean, the 90s.
It was in the 70s when the Marijuana Commission was alive and recommending, and it was the 70s and 80s when we were running around trying to get states to decriminalize marijuana. Now, the next major event in terms of the legalization movement was in 1996 when California legalized the medical use of marijuana. In other words, when we were fighting in the 70s, it was about decriminalizing personal marijuana smoking. It wasn't about medical marijuana. But by the time the issue surfaced in the early 90s and began to get some favorable attention again, the issue had been converted into a question of, is marijuana a helpful medicine? It was during the time of HIV, AIDS epidemic, and a lot of people were concerned with that, and a lot of people were concerned with diseases like MS and Crohn's disease and others, where the patients were telling us that marijuana gave them more relief than their pharmaceutical drugs did. So starting in 96, we got back on the winning track with medical marijuana in California. Today we have a total of 32 states that have approved some form of medical marijuana. And then starting in 2006, I guess it was, when we finally legalized recreational use of marijuana. It switched from just medical to we rolled it out for full legalization. And the first 2 states were Colorado and Washington. And we've been picking up 2 or 3 states every couple of years since that time. We just got Michigan with a voter initiative this past election. And we also got 2 other states, Missouri and Utah, that adopted medical marijuana. But again, once we got to about 2010 or 2011, the momentum began to pick up, and we've been moving ahead quickly since that time. I think we're well past the tipping point, to be honest. It makes me nervous to say this because I did live through that other era where we thought we were past the tipping point in the late 70s, and boy, we were proven wrong.
Yeah.
But by staying with it, we ended up on top after all. And I think now when you've got 2 out of 3 Americans favoring full legalization, and we've got a total of 10 states in the District of Columbia now that have full legalization, where we don't have to wonder if the sky's going to fall. We know it's not going to fall. In fact, legalization has been a very positive experience in the states that have had a chance to implement it. There was a lot of concern initially by anti-marijuana forces that if you legalize marijuana, you might have a sharp uptick in adolescent marijuana smoking. Well, fortunately, that simply has not been the case. In some of the states that have legalized, they've actually had a slight decrease in adolescent marijuana smoking, but in no state have they witnessed a spike in adolescent marijuana smoking. I suspect some of that is that I think kids always enjoy doing things that their parents don't want them to do. Now that marijuana is legal and their parents are smoking, it may not hold as much appeal to adolescents as it once did.
Yeah, and kids in general, I don't think they indulge like they used to in even alcohol, tobacco. I think from what I've read, those numbers are down.
Yeah, I don't actually know about the level of alcohol use by millennials, but certainly they are favorable towards legalization of marijuana. Definitely. There's no doubt about it. We, in all of the surveys, we get our highest support among the millennials.
It's over 80% at that age group, I think.
Yeah, but it's not the highest usage rates. I think the highest usage rates are 35 to 50. It's in that range.
Yeah, well, that's good. That's what you spoke about earlier, is getting the non-users to be supportive of the marijuana legalization effort. And if that's what we're seeing, especially in the millennial generation, then I guess we're building on that momentum and continuing on the right track. Would you say that's correct?
Yes, indeed we are. And it's not our goal at NORML, and it never has been, to turn people on. I don't care if people smoke or not. What I care about is I want to make sure that I'm left alone if I smoke marijuana responsibly. There's no justification for the government coming into my home, for example, and knowing what books I read, the music I listen to, how I conduct myself in the privacy of the bedroom, or whether I smoke marijuana or drink alcohol when I relax in the evening. It's simply none of their business.
Agreed. Do you have any advice for a state like New Jersey that's on the cusp of legalization, but there's, a lot of political struggle? What are your thoughts about a state like New Jersey?
New Jersey is important because it's in that category of states that do not offer a voter initiative. In other words, the first several states that legalized marijuana medically did it by voter initiative rather than through the legislature because elected officials were still frightened. They were concerned that if they voted even for medical marijuana, they might be defeated at the next election. So for the first several states that adopted medical use, we did it by getting it qualified for the ballot and going directly to the voters. Well, the same thing has been true about the first several states that legalized recreational use. Again, we found we had much more support among the American public than we had among elected officials.
Yeah, it's crazy.
But only about half of the states offer a voter initiative. I believe 24 offer and 26 don't, but I may have that reversed. At any event, what that means is that eventually, obviously, you have to be able to win these reforms the traditional way through the state legislature, because otherwise you're going to have half the country that's going to maintain marijuana prohibition. And I'm happy to say that over the last year, Vermont was the first state to legalize marijuana by way of the legislature. And New Jersey looks like it's probably going to be the second to do it legislatively. Yes. They are expected to do it before the end of this year. And, of course, New Jersey is an incredibly big and important state. So that's going to be a big step forward if that's accomplished. And, again, we have the support of the current governor as well as the president of the Senate and the Speaker of the House. So it looks like it's a done deal in New Jersey, although nothing's ever done with the state legislature until it's signed by the governor. But we're confident we're going to win New Jersey before the end of this year.
And it's great when a state like New Jersey starts building the momentum. Now we have New York and Delaware, Pennsylvania, Maryland that are all discussing at least medical, if not already, full legalization.
Oh, yeah. No, they're all discussing full recreational legalization as well. In fact, I think every state so far that has legalized recreational use first legalized medical use. And then after a couple of years of getting used to that, it seems to be easier for them to then be comfortable moving to full legalization. Again, as I said earlier, there was this feeling that it was just very risky to legalize marijuana, that it might have some unintended consequences that would be terrible for a state. Well, what we've been able to demonstrate over the last 6 or 8 years is no. There are no unintended consequences. It's simply it saves the state a lot of money that they used to spend arresting and prosecuting marijuana smokers. They raise hundreds of millions of dollars in tax revenue that they can earmark for schools or teacher salaries or whatever however they prefer to use it. But mostly the reason it's important is we were arresting over 850,000 Americans every year in this country at the height of Prohibition just a few years ago. Now that number has been reduced every time we legalize a state for medical use. That saves some arrests, and every time we legalize a state for recreational marijuana, that saves a lot of arrests. So we're down now, but we still have over 500,000 people arrested each year in this country on marijuana charges. So we still have a good bit of work to do before this job is done. And in particular, even in the states where we've legalized marijuana, there's still a lot to be done so that marijuana smokers are treated fairly in all aspects of their lives. For example, in most of the states that have legalized, either for medical or recreational, a private employer can still refuse to hire someone because they test positive for THC, or they can fire someone because they test positive for THC, even though it's legal to smoke in that state. Well, obviously, we need to change those laws. We don't want people going to work in an impaired condition, but neither do we want them fired simply because they smoke marijuana on the weekend, and then when they come to work on Monday, they have an unexpected drug test. Yeah. You can test positive for marijuana for several weeks after you last smoked if you're a long-term heavy smoker. But even if you're a casual smoker, you'll test positive for several days after you last smoked, but you're only impaired for maybe 90 minutes. So what we're arguing for is, in all situations, it should be determined whether the person is impaired. We similarly have problems today. If you've got a nosy neighbor who smells marijuana and calls the child welfare agency of a state, they sort of presume that the parents may be unfit parents because they smoke marijuana with no additional evidence at all. The first thing they do is they send someone out to do a home inspection. The idea being that if you smoke marijuana, your home may be filthy and unfit to raise children in. They then require the parents to take a parenting class and a drug education class, and those are not much better than they were back in the 1950s. But usually, after you jump through all those hoops and spend several $100s, you'll end up maintaining custody of your minor children, but only if you promise you will never smoke in front of those children. Well, my goodness, people who drink alcohol or smoke tobacco, they don't have any inhibition about doing it in front of the children. They don't have to fight to maintain custody, and neither should responsible marijuana smokers. A third area is driving under the influence of drugs. There are about a dozen states that currently have laws that say if you're stopped by the police and you test positive for THC, you are guilty of driving while impaired without any showing that you were actually impaired. Well, as I mentioned earlier, if you're a long-term marijuana smoker like I am, I would always test positive for THC, but I'm only impaired for maybe 60 to 90 minutes after I last smoked. Right. So we've got a lot of work to do to change those laws. We need to get rid of per se laws and make sure that the state has a legal obligation to show you were impaired before they can convict you of driving under the influence.
That's one of the arguments, even here in New Jersey, that they're trying to use against legalization, at least the prohibitionists and the pundits against it, is that they can't test for driving. But I mean, they do have road sobriety tests.
Oh yeah, they have roadside sobriety tests, but also there are several tests that are being experimented with around the country now, and several of them use like an iPad or a tablet. Okay. And so the officer on the side of the road, when he pulls you over, if he gives you a breathalyzer and determines that you're not drunk, but he still thinks you may be impaired, he can give you this little test with an iPad and determine whether you're impaired. I think they identify 5 or 6 criteria that would be part of being stoned. And again, NORML is not opposed to that. We want to be able to identify those people who are impaired so that we can keep them off the highways. We don't want to create danger. We don't think people should be going to work in an impaired condition, whatever the drug. But we also think it's terribly important that we not saddle people with convictions for things without some evidence that they, in fact, were impaired.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think as time goes on, people will see as the stigma lessens and these tests become available, hopefully that will become less of a concern.
And also the driving concern is one that I always find kind of interesting. Our opponents act as if
there's no one doing it now.
We have been walking for all these years rather than driving. In other words, what they act like, they'll basically say, well, if we legalize marijuana, you're going to have tens of millions of new impaired drivers on the highway. Well, I got news for you folks. About something like 35 million Americans smoke marijuana every year.
Right.
And most of us who smoke marijuana also drive a car. So it's not like these are new drivers on the road. We've been on the road for a long time. You just weren't realizing it, and you weren't focused on it.
Our guest Ken Wolski from a previous episode, who's the founder of the Coalition. Yeah, you know him, Coalition of Medical Marijuana.
Good. Yeah, Ken does great work.
He said that there's 600,000 people in New Jersey that already smoke marijuana. So what do they think? These people don't drive right now?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's as if there's a new risk presented. Well, it's not a new risk at all. There may be some risk of impaired driving, but if so, it's been there all along. It's nothing new.
And again, you couple that with some education programs and some road safety programs and, some preventative measures and some reliable tests that are accurate.
Well, and some of this we can help from our side, the marijuana smokers. For example, what the research tends to show is that marijuana impairs a person, but not nearly as dramatically as alcohol impairs a person. However, what you really don't want to do is use the two of them together and then get behind the wheel of the car.
Yeah,
because
recipe for disaster.
Together you really are impaired. There's no doubt about it. And so I think we need to better educate our own marijuana smoking community that, either if you want to have a couple of drinks, you might be fine, or if you want to smoke a joint, you might be fine. But don't do them together and drive. That clearly is too risky.
Yeah, there was just a study that came out recently that talked about how it was a research paper talking about marijuana's driving impact is much less than that of alcohol.
Yes.
So.
Just in the last couple of weeks, there was another one, but there have been several over the last few years. You're absolutely right.
How is the landscape of the cannabis world different today, or maybe in NORML different today than it was in the 70s and 80s? Well,
initially, we were focused on trying to stop arresting marijuana smokers. That was all of our energy was put towards that, because obviously, if the law still defines a marijuana smoker as a criminal, and you have 750,000 people or more being arrested and thrown in jail every year simply because of marijuana smoking, that's got to be the priority. Today, because of shifts in attitude, there are far fewer people arrested, and those people who are arrested, in most cases, are treated less harshly than would have been the case in the 70s or the 80s. Today, most people who are busted on marijuana, unless it's a substantial quantity, are going to get off with a fine and a period of probation. Most people don't spend any more time in jail other than a few hours when they're first arrested before they get bonded out. It's still unhealthy. You may lose your job. It may disrupt your family. I mean, there's all kinds of evil consequences associated with going through the arrest procedure. But it's a lot better today than it was in the past, because most people recognize that marijuana smoking is not particularly dangerous. It's far less dangerous than alcohol. And as I say, 2 out of 3 Americans now agree it should be fully legalized so that we can buy it in a safe and secure setting, and so that the marijuana is tested in a laboratory, so we know the strength of the THC and the CBD, and we know there's no molds or pesticides that may be harmful to the user. You can't achieve that kind of a safe market when you're dealing on a black market. You can only do that when you regulate and control it. So, again, I think we're well on our way to getting where we want to go, but I suspect we'll still be doing some work on this issue 10 or 15 years from now. Right now, we've got legalization in a number of states on the West Coast and a number of states on the East Coast, but Michigan is our first Midwestern state to legalize, and they just did it this past election. And we still haven't won any states in the South. So obviously, we're still going to continue to have marijuana smokers being treated like criminals until we can re-educate enough people in the Midwest and the South to make this shift countrywide.
Yeah, I agree. I think the work will continue for a long time, and especially in some of those states, those deep, I want to say red states. Do you find that that's the case? Is it kind of like, do you see a divide in the blue, quote unquote, and red, quote unquote, states as far as where they stand on legalization?
Without a doubt. Now, to some degree, marijuana legalization is bipartisan. You know what I mean? If you understand that prohibition causes more harm than the drug you're trying to prohibit, which is the reason we re-legalized alcohol back in 1931. It wasn't because we thought alcohol was harmless. It's because we realized that crime and corruption and violence associated with prohibition was far more dangerous for society than alcohol itself. And that's the same position we have with marijuana. So, I think without question, it's going to take longer in the Midwest and the South, but I think also without question, we'll eventually get there. You know, when we legalized alcohol, the federal government did not dictate that the states had to legalize alcohol. They simply backed the federal government out of the picture and said the states were free to do whatever they wanted. They could either maintain their criminal prohibition of alcohol, or they could begin to experiment with different models of legalization. And in fact, there were a number of states that maintained criminal penalties for a while. There are still some dry counties in Kentucky and Tennessee, for example, where you still can't buy alcohol legally. But mostly it's legal every place all across the country. And I think that's the same pattern we're going to see with legalizing marijuana. If some of the southern regions of the country want to hang on to prohibition for a little longer, they get to do that. That's the deal when you have 50 different states. They can move at different paces. But eventually, because the people are going to demand it, parents are not going to sit by and allow their kids to be arrested and treated like criminals in their state when the state next door doesn't. So I think without question, we will end up where we want to be. It's just going to take a little longer in the Midwest and the South.
Mm-hmm. You've written at least one book you've authored. Have you written a few books, or how many books?
Nope. That's it. It's really a history of NORML.
Okay.
The title of the book is It's Normal to Smoke Pot.
Yeah.
At some point, I figured that I should get down some of the recollection of the events for all these years, because I'm getting to be an old man.
Oh, you're a legend. You got to get the stories on paper.
I ought to have a record of it. Yeah, I came out, 3 or 4 years ago with It's Normal to Smoke Pot, the history of NORML, and it's available on the NORML website for those who are interested. Sure.
There's a chapter in there called Principles of Responsible Cannabis Use. Could you talk about that? What are they, in your opinion?
Yeah, we decided in the early 90s, mid-90s, the board of directors decided that we should proactively come up with a set of principles to demonstrate that we are, in fact, trying to do this in a responsible manner. And so we identified a number of key areas. For example, cannabis consumption is for adults only. It's irresponsible to provide cannabis to children. Okay, so it's adults only. That's one. Number two, the responsible cannabis consumer does not operate a motor vehicle or other dangerous machinery while impaired by cannabis. Number three, set and setting. The responsible cannabis user will carefully consider his or her set and setting, regulating use accordingly. In other words, don't be afraid to say no. You don't have to smoke every time somebody says you feel like having a joint. If it's an inappropriate time and place, then simply say no. Resist abuse. Cannabis use that impairs health, personal development, or achievement is abuse and should be resisted by responsible cannabis users. And then finally, respect the rights of others. And that is, a responsible cannabis user does not violate the rights of others, observes accepted standards of courtesy and public propriety, and respects the preferences of those who wish to avoid cannabis entirely. Where that last point comes into play frequently is when you go to on a social evening, you go to someone's house for dinner, you're invited to a party, etc. Obviously, it used to be that, if you smoke tobacco, for example, you'd just light up every place you went. Well, that no longer is the case. Now you have to ask if it's okay to smoke, and most of the time people are going to tell you to step outside. Well, the same thing applies to marijuana. Just because I think it's okay to smoke marijuana doesn't mean I have a right to introduce marijuana smoking in someone else's party or at a dinner where I'm a guest. So you always ask before you light up, and oftentimes you just volunteer to step outside so that those who don't want to be subject or introduced to marijuana smoke don't have to put up with it.
That's great. If our listeners wanted to find your book, where could they find it?
It's on the NORML website, just www.norml.org, and the same thing about the principles of responsible cannabis use. They'll find those principles also readily available from the website.
And in closing, what advice would you have for those looking to get into whether the cannabis industry today or maybe just looking to be stronger advocates? What could people do?
Well, if you're interested in trying to get into the newly legal marijuana industry, at least on the state level, in several states it's newly legal, I would say move cautiously because it's a new industry. It's sort of half legal and half illegal. It still remains illegal under federal law, and although the feds are mostly staying out of it and allowing the states to do what they want, there's no guarantee that's always going to be the case. For example, there's some discussion that your former New Jersey governor is being considered for the attorney general, and he was one of the biggest anti-marijuana zealots in the world when he was governor of New Jersey.
That'd be terrible.
In some ways, I worry that if he should be appointed attorney general, that we may, in fact, have the feds getting involved in trying to shut down the dispensaries on the state level. I hope not. And there are bills pending in Congress that, if we can get passed next year, would preclude the federal government from interfering with those state laws. But right now, it's kind of based on good faith right now. They're not bothering people, but that's not to say they won't. So I would say to people, be careful getting into this new industry. There will be some people who undoubtedly end up getting rich in the new industry, but there are going to be plenty of people who also end up probably having to file bankruptcy because there are going to be more people growing marijuana than the demand. There are going to be more retail outlets than we need to satisfy the demand of consumers. Already in the states that have legalized, by the way, the price of legal marijuana has taken a nosedive. It's significantly lower than it was when it was a black market, because when it was a black market, you had to pay extra for it because people were running from the police. Now, as to how to become an effective advocate, I would say if you go to the NORML website, we've got a place where you can volunteer if you want to start a NORML chapter, or if you want to find out if there's a NORML chapter in your area of the country, we can put you in touch with those people. And I would think it's much easier, if you want to work on this issue, to do it under the NORML umbrella than doing it on your own. NORML
is probably the largest activist group in the country, right?
Yeah, we are. In fact, we're really the only grassroots activist group. There are some other groups that do some good work on the issue, but they're not active on the grassroots level. We have people in almost every state in the country who spend hundreds of hours working with their state elected officials to try to first get marijuana decriminalized on the local level if necessary, and then get it decriminalized and legalized on the state level. So again, it's a lot easier doing it under the NORML umbrella because we have materials and talking points and everything already made up. So you kind of got a package ready to get started with. 2
points that I just want to just touch on. As you said, at the federal level, we're seeing more bills, and I do know some of the potential presidential candidates for the next upcoming election in 2020 already support the Marijuana Justice Act. And then furthermore, have you heard anything about the Trump administration pushing for federal legalization, or at least, like you said, with regards to prohibition, making it more of a states' rights issue now that the midterms are over?
Well, Trump has hinted on a couple of occasions that he would likely sign one of those federal bills if it were passed by the Congress. Whether I believe him, I have no idea.
Right.
He's such a inconsistent, dishonest individual that I wouldn't bet $1 either way. And frankly, I doubt it. I suspect we're going to have to wait until 2020 is behind us, get rid of Trump. And if we elect a Democrat, then I think without question, we'll get marijuana legalized on the federal level. It's possible it'll happen between now and 2020, and it's possible Trump will get behind it. But I kind of doubt it. He doesn't seem to me that he has the consistency to stay with anything very long. And, you know, he may be for it today and against it tomorrow.
Yeah.
He's a moron.
And with Christie coming, with the rumors of Christie circulating, I was just trying to be hopeful, too, that, you know, maybe if Trump is moving along those lines of pushing for it to be a states' rights issue, at least Christie will support that, I hope.
Well, and keep in mind that the Attorney General that was just fired,
right,
Jeff Sessions, was also an incredible anti-marijuana zealot. Probably the two strongest anti-marijuana people in the entire government that I know of would be Christie and Jeff Sessions.
That's who I would name.
It looks like we may well be having to deal with both of them. But even under Sessions, it was interesting. Apparently, Trump must have whispered in Sessions' ear that he did not want him shutting down state marijuana programs, because otherwise I think he would have.
Yeah, I believe about a year ago at the turn, or was it last? I don't know. One of the Januaries that passed, Sessions came out saying he was not going to support it, and then Trump, I think, put him in his place, and he at least got quiet about it.
Yeah, that's right. You're never going to get Jeff Sessions to support legalization. Yeah. But I think he cared enough about remaining as Attorney General that he was willing to focus on other areas. But again, with Christie, I don't know.
Yeah,
he certainly screwed things up in New Jersey when he was governor.
You don't have to tell me.
In terms of your marijuana policy. Yeah.
Yeah, in many areas, not just there. But, well, listen, Keith, thanks so much for taking time out. I know you're very busy with NORML, doing what you do. Just if you'd like to just close by telling our listeners how they could find out more about you, if you have any interesting projects or anything you'd like them to look at or review, or how could people find out more about you and your organization?
Well, if they have any specific questions or requests, etc., my email is just my first name, Keith@NORML.org. Remember, NORML does not have an A in it. It's an acronym, NORM as in Mary, L.org. Drop me a line if I can answer any questions, or if you're looking for any information. I'll be happy to respond and show you where to find it on our website.
All right. Thank you so much. We'll be sure to do that.
Yep.
And listeners can find a link to NORML in our post below. Thank you so much.
Thank you.